Before we move to law 3, here's a recap of law 1 and law 2. Remember, law 1 states when the bases are the same, they're being multiplied, we add the powers, and law 2 is when the bases are the same, they're being divided, we subtract the powers. With law 3, we get when a power is raised to another power, we multiply the powers. So if you find that the m, if you look at the first step, is raised by the n, so that's a power raised by another power, we multiply the powers. I normally tell my students that this is known as the superhero law, because when you get a bunch of superheroes together, their powers are being multiplied. So when one power is raised by another power, one superhero is raised by another superhero, we multiply their powers. So this is how you can remember this law. Looking at the first example, we have a power being raised by another power, so we know we have to apply the law that we just discussed, and therefore we would get the 3 being multiplied by the 2, and we will arrive at x to the power 6 as indicated. In the next example, I've included one where there is a number as well. There's a coefficient of 3. So we must know that whenever we are introduced to something like this, everything in the bracket must be raised to the power that's indicated. So the 3, that's the coefficient, will have to be raised, and the y to the power 5 will have to be raised by the power of 3. In this step here, I've shown you how it would work out. So the 3 is being raised by the power of 3, and the y to the 5 is being raised by the power 3. But notice that we are multiplying the power because of the rule that applies to powers. A common error in this type of question is that the 3 being raised by the power 3, the coefficient, learners normally say 3 times 3, and that will be 9. But you must realize that the 3 being raised by the 3 actually means 3 times 3 times 3. So that will give us an amount of 27. Something else to take note of is that the dot in between the two terms signifies multiplication. This brings us to our final step of 27 and y to the power 15. In this next example, I've included a negative sign, a minus sign. So this would mean that everything in the bracket must be raised by the power of 3. So that means minus 5 will be minus 5 times minus 5 times minus 5. That becomes 3 minus signs. And so, as I've taught you in previous videos, that because there's an odd number of minus signs, my answer will become a minus. And then we have the m to the power 4 will be raised by the power 3, and that will be 4 times 3, and that should give us m to the power 12. And therefore we have our answer. Something to note is a common mistake learners make is by saying minus 5 times 3, and they arrive at the answer minus 15, which is incorrect. Please know that the coefficient is always raised by the power, meaning it's minus 5 times minus 5 times minus 5, and that's how we end up with minus 125. In the next example, I've introduced 2 minuses to make sure you understand how the concept works, but always know that the power 2 indicated at the top of the bracket means only what's in the bracket will be raised by the power, and thereafter you do what's outside the bracket. So we have minus 9 to the power 2 will be minus 9 times minus 9, so that will be 2 negatives, minus 9 times minus 9, and we'll get an answer of positive 81. And then looking at the c7, c to the power 7, we have 7 times 2, and we'll have an answer of c to the power 14. Now we must notice in this step here we have only worked out what's in the bracket first. So now we have to deal with what's outside the bracket. Now outside the bracket is a minus sign, and it's being multiplied by what's in the bracket. Now something you must always know that examiners use this very often. The minus on its own, just standing like that, is basically meaning minus 1. There is an imaginary 1 in after that minus sign, so it's minus 1 times whatever's in the bracket. So Now in this step here we have a minus 1 that's in front of the bracket being multiplied by a positive number inside the bracket, and a minus times a plus will give us a minus answer. That's how we arrive at minus 81c to the power 14 as our final answer. This is another common type of question used by examiners. The m indicated there means m to the power 1, and learners must know this. So if we had to raise up everything within the bracket, it would be m to the power 1 being raised to the power 3 and n to the power 3 being raised to the power 3. So for the m it would be 1 times 3, and for the n it would be 3 times 3. And remember, we are working first with what's in the bracket, and then we will work out in terms of what's outside. So our next step would look like this. When we multiply the 1 times 3, we got m to the power 3, and the 3 times 3 will give us n to the power 9. Now the next step we know we have to do is deal with what's outside the bracket, and there is a minus 1 as indicated in the previous example, minus 1 times a positive which is inside the bracket. And multiplying this through, we arrive at our final answer, which is minus m to the power 3 and n to the power 9. And there's nothing else we could do to this, so we leave this as our final answer.